We get many visitors to the windmill. Why do they come? What's the attraction? I think windmills are part of our heritage. They're also in our genes. People understand them and they have a great love for them. My interest in windmills started just 12 years ago. I came here to ask a question. This was the nearest working windmill to where I had just moved with my wife. We found a millstone in the garden. It was a millstone grit stone. I'm an engineer and things like that interest me. And what do you do? Where do you go when you find something like that? So I went to the nearest working windmill, which is here. Heckington Windmill was built in 1830. It ran for 60 years with 5 sails, but in a storm in 1890, the top of the windmill blew off. The cap, sails, fantail blew off, and that was effectively going to be the end of the windmill. There was a miller, John Pocklington. He went to an auction where they were auctioning off an old windmill. It may seem strange to auction a windmill. It was Skirbeck Mill. It was one of the 7 8-sailed windmills that had been built in this country. 2 weeks later, he came here to Heckington, having been told that there was a ruined windmill by a railway. In Heckington, he came, saw it, and that day he bought the windmill, demolished Skirbeck Mill, and used the machinery from Skirbeck Mill, which had 8 sails, and built it here at Heckington on top of the mill that I'm sitting in now. And so this is, albeit not an original 8-sailed windmill, it is the only one left running 8-sailed machinery. And we are now saying it is the only one of this type in the world. Although we are an 8-sailed windmill, the milling process is identical whether we have 8, 6, 5 or 4 sails. The process is really remarkably simple. Grain is brought to the mill and hoisted up, and you may see the chain hoist that's behind me. The grain will be brought up in the large sacks through this trapdoor. It's at my waist height, simply because the sacks were so heavy, you didn't want to lift it further than you had to. So it's much easier to bring it up here and then pour it directly in. The grain comes from the floor above, down this chute, and then gravity brings it down here into this receptacle here. It's called a shoe simply because it looks like a shoe. So with the sails turning, this rotates, and when engaged, this rotates, and the top stone, the running stone, rotates with it. As it rotates, the shoe is slightly pushed out of the way. That's the sound of milling, and that's the grain being shaken down and dropping between the stones into the eye of the stone. I work here as the miller. This is my milling station. Directly above me are the millstones. The control I have here is really very limited. I can adjust the gap between the stones using this. It's called a tentering screw. I can make the gap between the stones slightly larger, or I can bring them back down closer together. And the flour comes from between the stones down this chute. There would be a sack fixed to the bottom, and I would then simply sample the flour in my hand. I crush it, open it up, and there'd be a pyramid of flour. I can knock it and it should just collapse. Or I have a second control, which is simply controlling the amount of grain that's going between the stones. And that's all. That's simply milling. Heckington Windmill Trust is a business, and as such we have to be sustainable. So our business plan is predicated on us making profit here. All of the profit goes towards the running costs of keeping the mill open to the public, and of course saving for the future for the repair and maintenance of the buildings that we're responsible for. 10 years ago we started what became our regeneration project, which required us raising in the end about £1.6 million, 82% of that coming from Heritage Lottery. That money was used to regenerate the site. Very little bit was spent in the windmill itself. majority was on the buildings that surround it, like the bakehouse, the brewery, and the visitor centre. The windmill is presently out of action. We were tailwinded just over 12 months ago, which means that the cap turned while we were milling, and we then had wind coming onto the back of the sails. Windmill's not designed to do that, and there has been some damage to the internal working parts of the windmill. We need to get the repairs carried out as soon as it can be managed to bring us back to our full business model again. Of course, the longer we are out of action, the longer we will have visitors coming to the windmill and not seeing the sails turn. We always turn the sails whenever that's possible, and clearly now not. With the windmill out of action, and it will be at least 12 months before we see the sails turning again, we can of course mill, because we have an engine-driven pair of millstones on the ground floor of the mill. We haven't seen a decline in numbers. In fact, our numbers have been steady, or in fact slightly rising. Our primary goal, of course, is to ensure that Heckington Windmill is still here and milling for as long as possible, as long as the building will allow it. That's what we do. We need visitors to come, we need to educate visitors on what the windmill does and the history of milling. But all of that allows us to earn money that will ensure the preservation of the windmill and the buildings around it for the foreseeable future.